The lance was a pole weapon or spear designed to be used by a mounted warrior or cavalry soldier. During the periods of classical and medieval warfare it evolved into being the leading weapon in cavalry charges, and was unsuited for throwing or for repeated thrusting, unlike similar weapons of the spearpike family typically used by infantry. Lances were often equipped with a vamplate, a small circular plate to prevent the hand sliding up the shaft upon impact. Though best known as a military and sporting weapon carried by European knights, the use of lances was widespread throughout Asia, the Middle East and North Africa wherever suitable mounts were available. As a secondary weapon, lancers of the medieval period also bore swords or maces for hand-to-hand combat, since the lance was often a one-use per engagement weapon. Assuming the lance survived the initial impact intact, it was usually too long, heavy and slow to be effectively used against opponents in a melee. Etymology: the name is derived from the word lance, the Roman auxiliary's javelin or throwing knife. Although according to the OED, the word may be of Iberian origin. Also compare long, a Greek term for lance. A lance in the original sense is a light throwing spear, or javelin. The English verb to launch, fling, hurl, throw is derived from the term, as well as the rarer or poetic to lance. The term from the 17th century came to refer specifically to spears not thrown, used for thrusting by heavy cavalry, and especially in jousting. A thrusting spear which is used by infantry is usually referred to as a pike. History of use. Antiquity. The second use of the lance in this sense was made by the Assyrians, Sarmatian and Parthian cataphracts from around the 3rd century BC. Long-thrusting cavalry spears were especially popular among the Hellenistic armies Agma and line cavalry. One of the most effective ancient lanced cavalry units was Alexander the Great's companion cavalry, who were successful against both heavy infantry and cavalry units. The Roman cavalry long-thrusting spear was called a contus. It was usually 3 to 4 meters long, and grasped with both hands. It was employed by equites contrarium and equites cataphractaria, fully armed and armored cataphracts. Middle Ages. The Byzantine cavalry used lances almost exclusively, often in mixed lancer and mounted archer formations. The Byzantines used lance both overarm and underarm, couched. The best-known usage of military lances was that of the full gallop closed ranks charge of a group of knights with underarm couched lances, against lines of infantry, archery regiments, defensive embankments, and opposition cavalry. Two variants on the couched lance charge developed, the French method, with lances in a double line, and the German method, with lances drawn up in a deeper formation which was often wedge-shaped. It is commonly believed that this became the dominant European cavalry tactic in the 11th century after the development of the cantled saddle and stirrups, and of rowel spurs. Cavalry thus outfitted and deployed had a tremendous collective force in their charge, and could shatter most contemporary infantry lines. Recent evidence has suggested, however, that the lance charge was effective without the benefit of stirrups. Because of the extreme stopping power of a thrusting spear, it quickly became a popular weapon of infantry in the late Middle Ages. These eventually led to the rise of the longest type of spears, the pike. This adaptation of the cavalry lance to infantry use was largely tasked with stopping lance-armed cavalry charges. During the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries, these weapons, both mounted and unmounted, were so effective that lances and pikemen not only became a staple of every Western army, but also became highly sought-after mercenaries. In Europe, a jousting lance was a variation of the knight's lance which was modified from its original war design. In jousting, the lance tips would usually be blunt, often spread out like a cup or furniture foot, to provide a wider impact surface designed to unseat the opposing rider without spearing him through. The center of the shaft of such lances could be designed to be hollow, in order for it to break on impact, as a further safeguard against impalement. They were often at least 4 meters long, and had handguards built into the lance, often tapering for a considerable portion of the weapon's length. These are the versions that can most often be seen at medieval reenactment festivals. In war, lances were much more like stout spears, long and balanced for one-handed use, and with sharpened tips. Lance. As a small unit that surrounded a knight when he went into battle during the 14th and 15th centuries, a lance might have consisted of 1 or 2 squires, the knight himself, 1 to 3 men-at-arms, and possibly an archer. Lances were often combined under the banner of a higher-ranking nobleman to form companies of knights that would act as an ad hoc unit. 16th century decline in Western Europe. The advent of wheellock technology spelled the end of the heavy knightly lance in Western Europe, with newer types of heavy cavalry such as reiters and cuirassiers spurning the old one-use weapon and increasingly supplanting the older gendarme-type medieval cavalry. While many Renaissance captains such as Sir Roger Williams continued to espouse the virtues of the lance, many such as Frenay Section de Lannou openly encouraged its abandonment in the face of the pistol's greater armor-piercing power, handiness and greater general utility. At the same time, the adoption of pike and shot tactic by most infantry forces would neuter much of the power of the lance's breakneck charge, making them a non-cost-effective type of military unit due to their expensive horses in comparison to cuirassiers and reiters, who usually charging only at a trot could make do with lower-quality mounts. After the success of pistol-armed Huguenot heavy horse against their royalist counterparts during the French Wars of Religion, most Western European powers started rearming their lancers with pistols, initially as an adjunct weapon and eventually as a replacement, with the Spanish retaining the lance the longest. Only the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with its far greater emphasis on cavalry warfare, large population of Slatin nobility and general lower military technology level among its foes, retained the lance to a large degree, with the famous winged Polish hussars having their glory period during the 16th and 17th century against a wide variety of enemy forces. 18th and 19th century revival. The mounted lancer experienced a renaissance in the 18th and especially in the 19th century. This followed on the demise of the pike and of body armor during the 17th century, with the reintroduction of lances coming from Poland and Hungary. In both countries, formations of lance-armed cavalry has been retained when they disappeared elsewhere in Europe. Lances became especially prevalent during and after the Napoleonic Wars, a period when almost all the major European powers reintroduced the lance into their respective cavalry arsenals. Formations of Uhlans and later other types of cavalry used 2 to 3 lances as their main weapons. The lance was usually employed in initial charges in close formation, with sabres being used in the melees that followed. Twilight of use. The Crimean War saw the use of the lance in the charge of the Light Brigade. One of the 4 British regiments involved in the charge, plus the Russian Cossacks who counter-attacked, were armed with this weapon. After the Western introduction of the horse to Native Americans, the Plains Indians also took up the lance, probably independently, as American cavalry of the time were saber and pistol-armed, firing forward at full gallop. The natural adaptation of the throwing spear to a stouter thrusting and charging spear appears to be an evolutionary trend in the military use of the horse. During the War of the Triple Alliance 1864-70, the Paraguayan cavalry made effective use of locally manufactured lances, both of conventional design and of an antique pattern used by gauchos for cattle herding. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 saw the extensive deployment of cavalry armed with lances on both sides. While the opportunities for using this weapon effectively proved infrequent during the conflict, the entire cavalry of the Imperial German Army adopted the lance as a primary weapon in 1889. The German lance was made of tubular steel and at 11 feet and 9 inches was the longest version in use. During the Second Boer War, British troops successfully used the lance on one occasion, against retreating Boers at the Battle of Elandslaagte. However, the Boers made effective use of trench warfare, field artillery and long-range rifles from the beginning of the war. The combined effect was devastating, so that much of the British cavalry was deployed as mounted infantry, dismounting to fight on foot. For some years after the Boer War, the 6 British Lancer regiments officially carried the lance only for parades. At a regimental level, training in the use of the lance continued, ostensibly to improve recruit riding skills. In 1908, the 9-foot-long bamboo or ash weapon with its steel head, was generally reissued for use on active service. The Russian cavalry discarded the lance in the late 19th century, but in 1907 it was reissued for use by the front line of each squadron when charging in open formation. In its final form, the Russian lance took the form of a long metal tube with a steel head and leather arm strap. It was intended as a shock weapon in the charge, to be dropped after impact and replaced by the sword for close combat in a melee. While demoralizing to an opponent, the lance was recognized as being an awkward encumbrance in forested regions. The relative value of the lance and the sword as a principal weapon for mounted troops was an issue of dispute in the years immediately preceding World War I. Opponents of the lance argued that the weapon was clumsy, conspicuous, easily deflected and of no use at close quarters in a melee. Arguments favoring the retention of the lance focused on the moral impact of having charging cavalry preceded by a hedge of steel, and on the effectiveness of the weapon against fleeing opponents. World War I and after lances were still in use by the British, French, Russian, Belgian, Turkish, Italian and German armies at the outbreak of World War I. In initial cavalry skirmishes in France, this antique weapon proved ineffective, German Uhlans being hampered by their long lances and a good many threw them away. A major action involving repeated charges by 4 regiments of German cavalry, all armed with lances, at Heilin on August 12, 1914 was unsuccessful. Amongst the Belgian defenders was 1 regiment of lancers who fought dismounted. With the advent of trench warfare, lances and the cavalry that carried them ceased to play a significant role. The Greco-Turkish War of 1919-22 saw an unexpected revival of lances amongst the cavalry of the Turkish National Army. During the successful Turkish offensives of the final stages of the war across the open plains of Asia Minor, Turkish mounted troops armed with bamboo lances from Ottoman stocks inflicted heavy losses on the retreating Greek forces. Those armies which still retained lances as a service weapon at the end of World War I generally discarded them for all but ceremonial occasions during the 1920s. An exception was the Polish cavalry, which retained the lance until 1936 but, contrary to popular legend, did not make use of it in World War II. Used as flagstaff, the United States Cavalry and Canadian Northwest Mounted Police used a lance-like shaft as a flagstaff. In 1886, the first official musical ride was performed in Regina, with this ceremonial lance playing a significant role in the choreography. The New South Wales Mounted Police, based at Redfern Barracks, Sydney, Australia, carry a lance with a navy blue and white pennant on ceremonial occasions. Other weapons, lance is also the name given by some anthropologists to the light flexible javelins thrown by atlatls, but these are usually called atlatl javelins. Some were not much larger than arrows, and were typically feather-fletched like an arrow, and unlike the vast majority of spears and javelins. See also, 10 pegging. References. Further reading, Delbra 1/4 CK, Hans. History of the Art of War, originally published in 1920. University of Nebraska Press, 1990. Volume 3, Medieval Warfare. External links. From Lance to Pistol, The Evolution of Mounted Soldiers from 1550 to 1600.